Have you tried the clicker?
No, I haven't.
Oh, it works. Great.
Okay.
Right.
Unbeknownst to you, we've not... well, my name's... Do you want to go to the next slide? My name's Paul Hayes, so I'm the VP of Design at Vital also. My colleague Shay, Moradi, will do our kind of who we are and what we do as we move through this presentation. But we're going for this now. Between myself and Shay, we're relatively new to Vital, but myself and Shay have known each other on and off and worked collaboratively across the last 20 years, but more so over the last 2. So this is our opportunity as well to kind of show you what we've been up to. So this is a bit of a learning curve for us in this space and working together.
Yeah, I think this is the first time we've actually attempted to do something like this. So.
And it's going really well so far, I'm sure.
Yeah. I thought it would be good to give you a bit of a background, a bit of context. We're both sort of new to automotive, really. The joke is that I don't actually have a driving license and he drives a Volvo, so...
there you go. It's only gets better and better, this.
We've somehow found ourselves working in automotive design, kind of creating visions of the future for the leading OEMs in the world. But how did we get here? What qualifies us uniquely to have a say in any of this, really? So my background was in teaching. I was teaching digital media and genuinely got very jealous of my students who were doing amazingly wonderful things for all these leading brands, working at the mill, frame store, similar to your students, really. And we started teaching at the same time, at the same university as well, I think. Or were you teaching before elsewhere?
Yeah, well, that's
just
another,
let's just
a
forget
that
trauma, right?
Yeah,
Let's
okay.
do. But I was sort of creating, so I got jealous of my students, I started my own agency, and, you know, fast forward 8 years, there's a huge sort of roster of work for brands, and a lot of it was just pure serendipity. There wasn't, you know, this major, you know, we were in the right place at the right time, creating apps, creating installations, and, you know, doing work that we were quite proud of. We felt like we were giving it our absolute best, utilising emerging technology of the time. And so now we've got a different series of kind of technologies and challenges to be looking at, really.
Yeah, I mean, I came in a slightly different way. One in the middle, you can all boo at if you work here. But yeah, my background, graphic design, and then ran my own studio for a while, worked at studios around Europe, and at the time kind of took on a senior lecturer role at a university, and then over the next nearly 20 years worked in and out of industry and academia in various roles, which you'll see in a moment. But this is what we were going to say at the beginning, like looking at these kind of logos and these, you know, these kind of experiences that have kind of made us who we are over the last 20 years is really important in what we're going to show you and how we get to them end results and the questions that we still have at the end of them deliverables as well. So, I'm either author, edit, or support making very big books that are really hard to post anywhere or move about the world. So, yeah, graphic design tend to make fairly large books, but yeah, this is me. So I've worked across publishing with long-term collaborators, and I'm invited to still comment on a lot of the kind of visual and graphic design across academia and industry, and that obviously folds into events, conferences, showcases, and still, you know, and again, we'll talk about this in terms of our team and how these kind of experiences feed into our studio, is that nurturing that new talent and just being kind of brave enough to make them decisions and risks as we move through these projects. So yeah, this is like...
If you were to distill it though, it's like, you know, you might describe the some of the outputs as like creative code witchcraft, and I would say yours is kind of visual
Yeah,
systems.
and that's really important to
design.
understand that even though we work really well together, I have no understanding about what you do.
There's
It's
overlaps. There you go.
Code
witchcraft.
We call it witchcraft. Magic stuff.
This is where we work. We work at Vital. This is the studio environment, as you know, over the ages and years. The pictures taken from different points in time. Effectively, the kind of 7 years or so that Vital have been running, the predominant sort of work is industrial design, but with a heavy slant in automotive. You know, there's a huge sort of growing series of areas in mobility design and experience design, where you're kind of looking at the holistic picture of how brand intersects with the product, how the product experience shapes how the brand is sort of perceived, and how those interactions lead to...
Yeah, and it's leaning on from all that, and as you'll see, like how Vital's evolving, how we're evolving with our family in Coventry. But this is a kind of a fairly retracted kind of list of people that we work with, or that we collaborate with, or you know, that we speak to on a day-to-day basis. And if you look at the kind of studio that Vital was, and we'll go through that in a minute, where it is now and where it's going, again, is a really interesting space for us to be in, and a real privilege to be in this space, especially as a visual designer, working with someone in creative technology, working in automotive, working in manufacturing and prototyping. And I think as we move through this, seeing where the products and the services that you're all familiar with, that are fairly probably like new to me, you can see how these new visions come across, and I think that was the whole point of us trying to do this, that we're not focusing on a process or a manufacturing arm, is that we want to kind of almost expose ourselves a little bit and share with you them successes. And it's not every day it's a good day, is it? So yeah, some of them frustrations around creating that great work. And just to go back to that slide, just to give you an idea of this isn't the whole team. I wasn't even here when you took this, so yeah. I'm not even on here. Shay's smiling, which is dead rare at work as well. But if you look at the top, we take on apprentices, we take on people straight from from early on. We want to nurture that talent straight through to experienced expertise that's been around in Coventry in the automotive scene for 30, 40 years. So it's a real breadth of education and knowledge that we harbour at Vital as well, which again is really important to this process of developing future vision.
We'll try and share some of the kind of key takeaways that I think make that experience valuable to the brands that we work for as well. The way in which we work, the process is what I'd like to talk about. Classic sort of origin story, effectively started off in a garage. This is James's garage on garden furniture. You can see the directors are busy. One of them's installing a 3D printer. The other one's on Google image search. And I'm not sure how different that is from these days. The cross-trainer isn't there, though.
We don't know where the cross-trainer's gone.
And this is the crazy thing. Some companies have a very sort of ballistic trajectory. They'll be given this gift of a crazy project right at the start. NIO weren't the global sort of brand that they are today. There's a Chinese sort of EV company that wants to make the world's sort of fastest hypercar. In 2015, Martin Leach approached these guys and said, you're either going to make this or you're never going to work in this sort of industry again. And they took the mantle because they had nothing to lose. They'd already skipped their jobs, and they were ready for a new challenge. So jobless, they decided to give it their all and borrowed a studio and equipment and all of that. And suddenly they made, in the span of a year and a bit, and there's the NIO sort of EP9 documentary, they made 6 of these for the Shanghai Motor Show. And it's still important to say what these are, because a lot of people don't necessarily know the detail of what goes into making a prototype vehicle, really. So fast forward to now, 7 years later.
Yeah, I mean, I thought you were going to go into how they were made, but we'll do that in a bit.
Yeah, we'll do that.
Yeah. So yeah, if you look at kind of, these are some of the clients and collaborators we work with now, 7 years on. Obviously, there's a list that goes beyond this that we can't share because everyone's got that list. And we also have, it expands beyond automotive. Obviously, like the mobility sector is growing and we're getting a lot of interest there, but also in startup and products and services that lend themselves to what we do best, but outside of that as well. So an interesting space for us at the moment is working within fashion retail, and arts and culture as well. So we're taking them automotive skills and applying them to different sectors. But then that informs what we do with these brands and the kind of outputs that we want to create as well. So we're constantly being challenged and challenging these labels of these brands and the people that sit behind this to kind of push that forward. And that's not to be underestimated, I think, at this point, is that we're in a really exciting space, but it's a really difficult space as well. And I think you'll all have that in your own kind of jobs and sector. But I think it's just worth mentioning that, yeah, we're on a great path. There's some great success stories, but yeah, that kind of sums it up really.
This little squiggle kind of shows you where we typically get sort of involved at the start of the journey and sometimes at the end. If you're making things that are typically realistic enough for manufacture, then you may as well be getting involved in the low volume manufacturing sort of stakes as well. But this pre-production journey is really exciting to me because it's just before that messy middle where you actually figure out how to really kind of productionize something. And so it's the land of sort of endless opportunity where you're setting a vision, you're helping fill in the gaps in an OEM sort of strategy, you're looking at all the other bits that they haven't got the time to develop.
And again, we'll feed that in later on in the presentation about all that kind of our knowledge and expertise from our past life feeds into... And we should say at that point that we spend most of our time on the left-hand side, the right-hand side of, that we spend about a day a month on that side, don't we?
So whenever we show our work to most people, the reaction that we commonly sort of get is, but is that CG? Like, they don't really, because most of us don't really come across these crazy, beefy-looking hypercars and the kind of aggressive-looking kind of lines and all that in the what, boys' bed?
Wow. Well, it is a bit.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. So effectively, we need to always show this slide as well, that these things are handmade and handcrafted. And if we were to kind of talk about what makes the analog and physical bit fit really well together, the bit in common is all of that kind of detail. It's the fact that these are realistic sort of prototypes that have other content, they call it, in there. They have fully working HMIs that are integrated with, say, the vehicle systems in order for them to give you the best impression of that experience.
Yeah, and I think that's where me and Shay come in, really. This is that kind of year 5, year 6 and 7 where everything evolves, and then prototypes evolve, and then visions evolve, and the aspirations and ambition gets bigger around them projects. So the more creative technology is embedded in that, and then where I come in is like setting that kind of vision, that kind of brand ideal around that, whether it's from a startup or new market where we almost like, and again, getting ahead of myself, but we kind of inform that brand strategy, but we can also kind of support and supplement that within our existing kind of workflow as well. So
could give you an example of a vehicle sort of startup that we've worked with. This is, I can mention this now because we got the permission in the car to mention it. So
it's being
this particular client, they're a sort of a startup in the hydrogen space, and they're making commercial vehicles that run on hydrogen. So effectively it's an EV vehicle, but it's got hydrogen sort of power source, so it's got a fuel cell in it. The design language that goes with the sort of systems within that, the interactions, the typical way it sort of is driven, all of those things are different. And I think what we find is in the new sort of world of electric mobility and in new sort of power sources and powertrains, you're going to have to find ways of describing how things should behave and how they should act, and it's slightly different than the old world. And the way we do that as well, the way we prototype it, is effectively, that's me, by the way.
That's the joke, by the way.
There's something special about this slide, though, that we should perhaps describe.
Yeah, I mean, mentioning the client, or even, I don't know if we've got time to mention it later on, but just that journey from, we've started with these from the very beginning, so we've built this with them from the ground up, and having that relationship with that client, and then moving into the, you know, the creative electronic element and the kind of user driver experience, and using the visual design elements of that. So we've kind of like invested a lot of our time and our kind of innovation around this.
If I could say, to understand what the actual sort of requirement is, that insights journey started well before we committed to doing visual design. If we don't understand how people are going to be using this vehicle, then we've got very little chance of being able to affect it positively.
But it's a rare thing, and I think this is what, if you just stay on that slide for a sec, it's like to be so close to the, especially as a graphic visual designer, to be this close to the manufacturing process, and to be able to talk to people like Shay and the coders and the people that are making, I don't even know what half the people do who make this stuff, but we get on really well, and to have that kind of day-to-day conversation is really important. And I don't think it's not the clearest image.
It's a bench test of the HMI, so the human-machine interface that we're using, the screen that we have in the previous sort of picture, is being tested there, and then there's a version that's being installed. But the person who's installing it, Wayland there, appearing all dark and moody there, Wayland is actually integrating the software on a USB stick directly onto the HMI there. So there's this sort of parity between the physical and the digital work, and it gets tested and then tested again on the actual demonstrator vehicle.
The great thing for me in this about that, going back to the the university days, is Wayland is a product designer. I've kind of spent a year with him around the visual and graphic element. He's on the shop floor installing electronics, and I think for anyone who while we're in an educational space, thinking about that in terms of new talent coming out of universities, and actually the reality of this is that's a really exciting place to be as well, seeing 23-year-olds, 22-year-olds taking on all these different kind of contexts within their roles. But again, that adds to that vision, it adds to that richer discussion and discourse in the studio when we're coming up with like new concepts. So we wanted to share some of it with you. Obviously, like, this is the best bit of our job, is that everything's really exciting and secret, so we can't really show too much, and we can't really show it off. So what you're seeing here is kind of a half-baked version of something that's quite exciting. That'll be
progressed on a fair bit.
On a e-vehicle at some point. But just to move through this is the exciting bit, and it kind of supports what we saw in that image that you've just seen, is to be able to get close to the prototyping and manufacturing and development of these vehicles or these products, being able to then integrate our own kind of vision and language that's embedded in that as well. And then to, like, especially with this project, where we're playing with even character forms and all this kind of companionship and kind of, I suppose, non-traditional elements that you would find in HMIs, or like that you wouldn't find necessarily in cars that are being put out now. This is the kind of work we get to do that is not forgotten about, but is given very little priority in production vehicles. As you all know, depending on what cars you've got, it's pretty dull. It might look quite slick, but it's they all kind of serve a purpose, and they all sit on a straight line, whereas we get to set that kind of vision, and we get to push it a little bit more.
One of those sort of key unlocks is that when we've sort of traditionally seen HMI development elsewhere, some of it is done in isolation, some of it is tested in isolation, some of the user testing takes place might not be as insights-led and not as well documented as the way we're sort of attempting to do it. And again, some of that is entirely sort of us sort of figuring it out. Some of it is fairly kind of standard and common in the industry. It's just that getting involved at the early stage where pre-production, they never had to use sort of a display in that setting, in that context. But now people, when they sit, I went to the Paris Motor Show 2 weeks ago, and the first thing people do now when they get inside vehicles is they start poking around at that screen, massive screens. And I think that it's almost like an expectation that forms part of the whole product experience. So I don't want that to be a terrible one. I want to make sure it integrates with my phone, that forms part of the language. And then there's entire ecosystems that sit around it. So who does the visual language? Is it the vehicle designer who does that? In a little startup, there's very little. Even at the big sort of OEM stage, they're really quite regimented and siloed. They get the sort of the work kind of filtering down until it gets to that granular component where you can't really change the overall language. You can't start adding characters in there. You can't do all of that.
We'll just talk over these slides, but we don't proclaim to be the best or we have all the answers, but what's really important, I mean, you can't see it on this slide either, but just it's important for you to know that studios like us exist and this work exists as well, that we are challenging this space. We do want to, and it's a great challenge for us as well. This is not easy work. People want safe and things that are recognisable and don't want that change, even though the brand
scared of
message might say
they're not as bold
otherwise,
to just sort of define certain elements right at the start. People want to defer decisions a lot of the time. So
me working out. Just to give you some, I mean, again, just conscious of time, but just to show you the amount of detail that we are going into some of this work as well. So it's not just, I don't want anyone to think, or we don't want to think that all this is kind of like the icing, then there's no cake underneath it. It's important that this is real work. Like we're integrating this. Our vision is that this goes into production, and if this isn't going into production, then it's something that sits very close to it. So we're not just making eye candy for Pinterest or Instagram. This is real kind of thorough
and sometimes
work.
We get a chance to do that for our own products as well.
Yeah,
so as we're going through it.
Yeah, I mean, Shay will talk more about the app and the software that we're developing. But in terms of them icons, just for me, it's kind of, I mean, we can get some examples further on about the capture. So but it's just to show you some
just want to blitz through some of the basics, right? People often ask us, is it just a case of you're printing a car? Well, the work that goes into finishing that sort of vehicle in part form is what makes it really special. That's what turns something from effectively a sketch and a basic model that's printed in compostable sort of material to a £100,000 work of art with a Bugatti sort of colour finish on it. This was a collaboration that we did with Rob Melville. It's what we did in our sort of... Rob Melville was the chief designer at McLaren. He's now another... he's elsewhere in the world, but we took one of his sketches and we took it through the paces and created this sort of art object out of it. But usually use this to show that something like that doesn't just sort of get printed in one go, and there's so much sort of process that goes into that. One of the key unlocks for us is that as part of our sort of appetite for R&D, we started experimenting a long while ago with making our own 3D printer as a way of interrogating how that would work. At a time when people wanted to make things bigger, we're like, well, can we do this? Is there a process by which you can take some open source software, you can use a framework to make your own sort of 3D printer? And that sort of level of insight, or that attitude to work is really kind of the bedrock of some of the other sort of things that we're going to be talking about. The other one that I'm really keen to stress is the level of detail that goes into it. When something is made physical, those sort of perceived quality aspects are so important. Our fingertips are incredibly precise. Our eyes pick up the minutest of sort of color variations, and it's not just us designers. People notice those things. They might not be able to sort of necessarily articulate it, to the point that in a smaller sort of model, there'll be a fully working sort of engine of sorts in there that maybe a lot of people won't get to see, but if someone does lift that sort of hood, they'll be able to see that. This is a 3D print that Formlabs is exhibiting. It was our work for a client called GTO at Formnext this month.
2 weeks?
Yeah.
Anyone in Frankfurt? 2 weeks? Hopefully see you there.
It's a crowd.
Or just avoid me.
It's the engaged people who are still around. They're the hardcore crowds. But if you're making things to that level of detail, you may as well explore making the low volume production version. If there's for example, if there's a hypercar where they're only going to make a few hundred of those, then could we do the creative electronics, the Iron Man's heart at the back of the Pininfarina Battista, for example, in low volume manufacturing terms? Is that something that we have the capability? We are doing it. We have a clean room. We have the sort of skills to create the firmware for this, to go through all the homologation steps to turn it into something that is used in a production vehicle. These are the other bits that I think make the challenge a bit more level for us, and we'll go through them bit by bit really quickly. We use spatial design a lot. It condenses timeframes in such a way that I've never sort of witnessed before in my sort of 20 years of doing professional design. The fact that you can very immediately get a sense of how and where a physical form is going to massively help reduce the time to get through a design iteration in a loop. So some of these things don't even require any development time for us. This is using Reality Composer, and I'll get to the bit where we create our own software as well. But figuring out where the shut lines are in a low fidelity model, to figure out where those sort of key markers are for your design while you're inhabiting the space is absolutely vital and crucial. We also make a lot of these sort of low resolution sort of bucks. These allow us to design in situ. That's the vehicle designer, the guy you saw who was testing the HMI bit earlier, Pete, sat in one of the trucks, and our designers working with him in the same collaborative space, looking at the space claim, also being able to see where the visibility and sight lines are as well, which, again, when you're positioning where that seat goes, it's like a step of validation that occurs while design is occurring. When has this ever been a thing? You have to make the thing and then validate it. But we're validating as we're going along. And sometimes you see the kind of demonstrating being built at the same time as the changes that you're making. This is like the rapid pace of it. So you're condensing timeframes that were originally a year and a half into 3 months or less, way less sometimes. And the thing still looks the same, but it's had all that benefit of insight into it.
I think just for us, it's worth saying that a lot of these processes have evolved and developed and moved on. So they're a lot more sophisticated than maybe what we're showing you now. But obviously this is what we can show you at the moment.
Another key example is the sort of ergonomic reach and the visibility of, say, the HMI. Taking those early stage designs for the HMI and bringing them in here, being able to test it with users, real users, is something that hasn't necessarily been done before. So what do you do in the time that you free up, right? If you consider the landscape of emerging technologies and computational sort of capability, you get to play, you get to do other things with it, and those sort of things are only special when you start to stack them together. And I think we talked a lot about this as well, but the reason why sort of that art object was done in a short frame of time was that we actually wanted to play with the actual brand itself. Those art objects sit within a world around them.
I mean, it was like just developing that conversation, and all them. We've all done it where we wish that we'd do something, we promise that we'll do it, or we'll meet up next week, and we kind of invest that time in actually putting work out that challenges us, that hopefully will inform.
Yeah, it's
next
case of more is more, really, as opposed to.
It's good for the studio as well. It's good for the the younger members of staff and the older members of staff. They kind of connect the studio, all the family together as well, because there's a touch point that runs through every element of the studio as well. So it's the conversational piece, but they also connect us in terms of our knowledge and expertise.
And perhaps the other aspect of it is that they bring us outside of that siloed mentality of our objects and our creations.
Nobody will be making that kind of stuff
in our
and
That leads me on to something else as well, which is some of these R&D bets lead to much greater things for us. So we challenge ourselves on occasion throughout the year with what we call our manifesto projects. We had an opportunity to do a showcase for the Transport Museum in Coventry, and it was to perhaps look at the way pedestrian interactions are like in front of autonomous and semi-autonomous vehicles. If only you could interact with the artificial sort of driver, what form or shape would that take? Is there a playful way of exploring that? So we use machine learning to detect the body pose of the person. This was during the height of the pandemic, so people were wearing masks still, couldn't really use facial markers. Instead, we used the whole body. And that was just a serendipitous thing. There was no, oh, we're going to do this and we know what to do. No, it was just, can we do this? We did this in under 2 weeks. The whole thing was made, coded, and what it actually led to, that little experiment or conversation, as you sort of put it, led us to look at ways of optimizing the way in which we analyze certain aspects of the vehicle design as well, where the step zones are, where the grab handles are. What if we could show that evidentially, right? Of course, you can run a clinic and you'll have people in it and you'll do mannequin drops and all sorts of different ways of exploring how people use it, but it won't be as good as if you were collecting that data as objectively as possible. And here's some more examples of where it gets stacked, where we sort of combine that with the VR sort of aspect. And this is the piece of software that we can demo and show you that we've created ourselves. Again, looking at...
These are purely for illustration at this point, so don't be looking at them skeletons thinking, look at these strange things. So yeah, these were just used to kind of show and demonstrate. So if we have got time...
To develop the visual language, we have the live sort of app to share with you, and we're happy to organise demos of that. So again, as we're talking about this, what's next? If everything we're producing is sort of content, then effectively partnering up with people who have other facilities and other ways of visualizing becomes really sort of salient to us. And for us, this was a partnership, a collaboration that we had with Production Park. Robin, who's sat there at the back, sort of invited us up to have a little exploration of their LED volume. How do we hook our systems to theirs? How do we start to validate and evaluate some of the things that we're creating with their sort of content? How do we bring AI into the mix, for the pre-production journey of virtual production? How do we sort of get the best outcomes?
Even that experience and being open to that, and the stuff that went and came back, and the
how much
ideas that was generated out of that as well is, I'm always going to have that in me, and it's kind of interesting how that breeds a really positive studio culture.
So the last point is just to step outside of that sort of silo and zone. That tends to get amazing results for us. And so we're massively open to partnering with people who have technologies that they want to explore. Thank you.
Hopefully, we're in time.
I think we managed it on time.
Thank you.